Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 68 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Kurt and Jerry to continue our series on heart rate variability. Today, we're talking about heart rate variability and social support. So we have an interesting article to talk about. As always, we'll put this article up on traumainformedlens.org in the show notes. So if you want to even take a break and look through it before the show, you listen to this, might be a good idea. But I think we'll cover the high points for sure as well. So Kurt, Jerry, great to have you back. Excited for this episode and this article. And as always, we start out with bright, shiny objects of the week. And Jerry, I'll start with you this week. What are you thinking about this week?
This week, I'm probably been thinking a lot about federal workers that probably are struggling with the issue of trying to take care of their lives while our government officials struggle with their own trauma up there. And just like all of us who work with traumatized individuals, their trauma impacts many other people. So I want to thank those workers that are continuing to go to work to provide services for people without getting pay, and also send support to families who are struggling with the impact of some of this stuff that's going on in our government. Yeah,
I echo that. Boy, going to work without pay. I mean, I know people go to work for more reasons than money, but oh man, hug a TSA agent if they let you. Because wow, what a job.
Maybe just give them a high five.
Give them a high five, yeah. Well, they get you. I won't go to that joke. I'll leave that one just hanging. So, something about a pat down. You can go where you want with it. So, Kurt, what about you? What are you thinking about this week?
Well, clearly we've gotten you woke up now. I haven't seen you guys in a couple of weeks, so that's a bright, shiny object for me. Yes. It's great to see you both and be able to chat.
New year.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think there's so many to pick from, honestly. I get such great interactions with people in the areas where I get the privilege to be, like working with some of the counties around the Denver metro area, and just seeing how hard people work and how much people care at the work that they do is always such a pleasure and an honor to be a part of. So folks at Weld County Department of Human Services, I get to interact with them quite a bit, and just wanted to send out a little shout to them on how hard they work and how much effort they put into providing care to kids who are in the child welfare system. They're really a great group of people, and I've had the opportunity to be involved with a couple of kids who are in their care that they're just doing such a bang up job of trying to support some kids that have some real significant challenges. So it's always inspiring to see and be a part of.
Very cool. So I got a few. I'll make them all kind of short, and one kind of leads us to the podcast. So first, I got some new swag that I love to show off. Galileo Middle School, I did a training with them about a week ago, and got a really cool sweatshirt and had a great time with them. So I know we have some new listeners from that training, so I want to welcome everybody. Go Bulldogs. Other thing, just to look at too, is, I've been talking about the Welltory app that I've been using. And it was an interesting experience because, and I asked the question is, I'm really screwed up. And is this heart rate variability kind of more of a state, an ongoing moment, or is it fluctuating a lot? And we kind of talked about them mostly as a state. And I was getting these terrible readings where like my stress level was over like 100% every time. It's like, I didn't know like when I was going to die because my heart rate variability was so terrible. And then I said, okay, I'm going to just try. There was 2 ways on Samsung phones to measure them. One's there's a heart rate thing in the phone, which I was using. And then there was the flash, use your camera to take measure. I was like, I just got to try this other way to measure it. And I'm fairly healthy, which is good news. Like, so you know, I've got a whole new sense of this app since our last podcast where I talked about it. Good news is I'm not going to die because I'm at 100% stress level 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But it reminded me of, and I think it was a podcast, and I looked back really quick to make sure it wasn't a book that I could suggest to people, and I didn't have the time to search down the exact episode, but there's a movement in social science, which this kind of reminded me of when I changed my input to my data and got a whole different output. Is there's a movement in social science to really go back to some of the foundational studies and research articles that we've based a lot of our theories on over the years and just kind of double check. And so there's been a movement where they've gone through and done, I think several dozen, if not more, redone some of these famous research studies. And what they found with better measurement techniques, more computer measurements, and just kind of redoing the studies, they got extremely different outcomes. In fact, some of these studies, the conclusion at the end of the article was the opposite of what a lot of us have thought these studies were throughout the years. So it just reminded in my own personal experiment on heart rate variability, boy, I changed the way I was measuring it. And all of a sudden, my measurements, just seemed more accurate to the states that I was feeling. And it just reminds me sometimes making sure that, that we check our inputs sometimes can really help. So I want to let our listeners know I'm a lot healthier than I thought I was. Again, make sure the app's working right and you don't get depressed like I was about it. So the other thing, too, that's interesting with the app now that it's actually working is I can really see quite a bit of differentiation before and after certain events. So taking a measure before a workout and shortly after the workout, it's a lot different. After a good night's sleep, it's a lot different. I've read this thing, which I'm not a huge fan of these right now, but contrast showers where you go from hot to cold is supposed to be really good for heart rate variability. I can see impacts of that. So it is a very interesting thing. While maybe there's not huge swings in it, you can see how certain activities can increase heart rate variability. And I've just tried to strategically add those kind of throughout the days, whether it's mindfulness practice, contrast showers, breathing exercises. So I'm not dying, which is good. And again, it's an app you might want to check out once you get the right measures. So just to throw that out there.
If you want some help with an ice bath, just let me know. I'll come and do it.
I'm not a cold shower is way more than I even want to be doing for a minute. I did a few of those.
You could do one of those up in Boulder. They do those dives every year up in the ice.
Oh yeah. Well, so we have frozen dead guy days up in Netherlands where I used to live. They did that as well. Yeah.
We'll post a picture of Matt in a snowstorm sitting in Boulder Creek.
Yeah, exactly. We'll see. We'll work up to that because a minute of a cold shower right now is about as much as my body wants to take. So we got this article today. It seemed like a lot of variables going on here. We have heart rate variability, a stressful life event, social support, and depression. So there's kind of for kind of a study with a few hundred people, there were a lot of variables going on. So Kurt, I'll kind of hand it over to you to kind of put these variables together. And I think this article can spur a lot of discussions, especially around that social support piece.
Yeah, and toss in their social engagement as another.
Yeah. There's 5.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the basic premise of the study was they're going on the theoretical assumption, which has a lot of good data behind it, that cardiac vagal control has a big impact on depressive symptoms and the expression of the development of and the expression of depression symptoms. And so the way that, and actually their measurement device, or the method that they use to measure heart rate variability, is a different one that we haven't talked about before, this measure of respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which are fluctuations in your heart patterns based on when you inhale and when you exhale. There are some variations in heart rate variability that happen as a result of that. And that's another way that's I mean, it's real similar to a lot of the measures we've been using, which are the high frequency band of a power spectral analysis, and some of those things that are just, that's enough detail that, we don't need to get into that. But so basically there's enough overlap between those two measures to make some comparisons between the studies we have talked about and this study. So their premise was that with the ideas that when depression symptoms happen as a result of stressful life events, then a lot of the prevailing view has been that if we just provided enough social support, that we could help to manage depression symptoms. And they wanted to ask the question of, is that true? And does heart rate variability or our physiology have an impact on how well we can access social support and how well social support can have an impact on us? And to boil it down, the answer was yes. And in a variety of ways, and in some pretty interesting ways. So they had recruited, this is actually done in the Denver area, which is kind of fun being in this area, to think that it was done in recruiting subjects in the hospitals and the laundromats of Metro Denver is kind of fun to think of. So they recruited, I think the number was 130 by the end of weeding some subjects out of the study. People who had experienced a qualifying stressful life event and who had experienced depressive symptoms, and then categorize those two into high heart rate variability, or high RSA, and low heart rate variability, or low RSA. And then also further categorize those groups by their social environment being characterized as high in social support or low in social support. The social support part, I think there's a detail in there that I think is really, really pretty interesting. At least it was to me when I first read it, and that they used a questionnaire, an assessment tool that gave some subscales or some characterization and further categorization of social support in terms of what types of social support are important. And I thought this was a really great part of this study that I took away from when we think about social support as having components to it that are important, like having somebody that you can call when you have material needs as a part of social support, or having somebody that you can get a validation social support need, somebody you can just talk to and that you can vent to. And then there's also this part of social support, which is a companionship social support, somebody to do things with. So I thought that was a really interesting part of this study that I've used that for for several years since I read this, and how we think about asking people questions about what's your social environment like and where are the missing holes in your social support system. I thought that was a great thing to pull out of this article. So then they looked at whether or not you had high or low social support among these two groups of high or low heart rate variability, and whether or not the individuals in either one of those groups engaged in social support, whether or not they engaged in behavior that accessed that social support. And I thought that was a really cool thing to bring into this, that was a great overlap for me between the two worlds that we talk of often of, there's a behavioral perspective and there is a therapy perspective. That in this one, it's awesome that the social engagement, which is engaging in social behavior, didn't necessarily happen whether or not social support was available. And a lot of what predicted that was heart rate variability, or our physiology. And it was very predictive of whether or not, even in a high social support environment, if your physiology wasn't in that high RSA group, people didn't tend to engage in behavior to access the social support. And if they did, it almost blocked the effects of social support. And so your physiology then enhances or can detract from the impact of social support on depressive symptoms. So I thought that was a really interesting way to look at depressive symptoms and the impact of social support, and what we can do, some of the things that we can do about engaging in and encouraging and motivating behavior that is consistent with social engagement or accessing social support in our environments, and give us a little understanding for, even though we are providing environments that are high in social support, why it may be difficult for some patients to actually access that social support. So some great things to kind of pull out of that, but that's kind of a general overview of what the study was and what some of the results were. This has been one of I'm kind of picking my favorites as we go through these, and this is obviously right in there. And I love the ideas of thinking about social support and a social environment being different than the behavior of social engagement, and thinking about those as different intervention points. I thought was one of the great things to pull away from this article.
Jerry, what are your thoughts?
You know, I think that the differentiation between the availability of resources and the capacity to engage in action to access those resources is a very relevant to working with and understanding the impact of trauma. Is that many of the clients that I've worked with over the years develop certain expectations, develop certain phobias, fears, anxiety about engaging in certain behaviors, either because it's associated with their trauma, or it, in some ways, activates an experience inside of them that they don't want to deal with, right? And so this conditioning that goes on when we're exposed to adversity, especially in the context of interpersonal relationships, kind of gets associated with certain behavioral defensive strategies that in some ways protect the individual, but what we know is in the long run is they interfere with their ability to heal and recover from those, right? And so if we kind of understand that in some ways, and understand that initially the trauma was some type of external event that was happening, but really it gets reenacted over and over again either in a cognitive event that impacts our biology, and then in some ways our biology, our reaction to the environment, is what maintains it. So in this sense is putting lots of social resources available to an individual when their biology is not signaling safety, they can't access them, right? And so I think the takeaway for me is you have to work both with somebody's social environment, but you also have to kind of be sensitive and providing them either physical, behavioral ways to change those internal states, or in some ways, cognitive ways to change those internal states. So you can't do one or the other, that it really takes a comprehensive, which means that oftentimes working with individuals who are traumatized is a very complex process where there's sometimes competing variables, right? So the competing is we're trying to be helpful and supportive, but the individual is actually getting activated by that, right? And if we're not providing those supports, the individual is left alone. So it becomes very, very difficult. And I think having frameworks, as this article gives us, it begins to help us understand how we have to address these complex issues with a more comprehensive clinical approach.
Those frameworks, I certainly find, I think this may be an oversimplification, but at times, sometimes you need a framework to just help you to keep at it, essentially. Just keep trying. Trying to understand and keep trying to get more nuanced in the interventions that we're attempting next. And keeping that motivation is often one of the largest challenges of supporting people who experienced a lot of significant trauma.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of, I think a lot of this whole series is sort of, bringing up the question is like, heart rate variability in some ways seems like a reflection here of, I don't know, it's like, what are we looking at heart rate variability as sort of a reflection of their social health and their mental health in some of the ways when you look at the stressful event and maybe their lack of social support / engagement, or is it, in some ways, is it a reflection? Is it an equal sort of, we need to look at it both in kind of real time? Could we look at, to improve depressive symptoms, could we even, for some people, skip the social support altogether, even though I'm being a little, over the edge with that, obviously, but then just really work on things that increase heart rate variability. So I just kind of have this question about kind of, okay, is this the chicken? Is this the egg? Are we talking about 2 chickens? Are we talking about 2 eggs? It's like, it's kind of like, like in my own thinking, with that very confused question, I wonder if either of you have any kind of thoughts. Again, as I measure my own thing, it seems like a reactive thing to things I do. But yet I'm wondering if I keep over time doing things that help heart rate variability, if overall my scores will improve, which I think they would. So, chicken, egg, chicken, any thoughts on that? Am I just totally off with this question?
One of the things that the article I thought was a great kind of theoretical piece from the article that talked about the similarities in the neuroanatomical systems involved with both managing cardiac control and with social engagement, that they are overlapping neuroanatomical systems. And so that one I think is a really, really fascinating thing to think about that. Then your point is a really good one, right? Like if we do things to change heart rate variability, that can really have a strong impact on our ability to engage socially. That's really important, but it's a change that happens in a subtle way. It's not like that would take time, and it takes repetition, and it takes a lot of intervention, and so that goes back to that point that I was thinking about. Just keep at it, and that's part of what we have to do is often keep at it for longer than we think that we have to.
You know what, Matt? I think this the awareness that therapy tended to be so cognitive and verbally based, right? And the thought was, if I could talk about what's going on, make social contact, I can get better, right? And I think what this tells you is we can provide a change in state by engaging in certain types of action,
And just
Right?
for our listeners, a state is sort of a short-term mental, emotional.
Right. So a state, you could be in a state of hunger, you could be in a state of
Yeah.
fear, you could be a state of joy, you could be in a state. Our states change, but by engaging in certain behaviors, so that what we know is research on yoga impacts heart rate variability. We know that engaging in physical activity changes heart rate, as you do. So this expands the type of therapeutic possibilities that we can use to increase people's openness. So when I was at I was running a residential treatment center. We oftentimes, prior to having some of this knowledge, would put children in therapy, and they'd be very, very resistant. They'd be very unable to effectively use it. They would be in a defensive state. And what we found is that it's not that therapy wasn't a useful intervention, but the children who had been traumatized, neglected, exposed to maltreatment, couldn't make effective use of that. Mm-hmm. But when we added yoga to the program and recreation and pet therapy, there seemed to be their ability to utilize the therapy time increased, right? And if we didn't have a study like this, we might not even connect those things, right? It's like, oh, it just was a matter of time, and this child began to feel more comfortable and created a therapeutic alliance. But really what I think was happening is we were providing pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activities that was helping these children regulate their bodies to, in some ways, come to therapy in a different state, which changes their perception and expectations that allowed them to make better use of it. Mm-hmm. Right? And so when you're developing programming, you think about, well, I could just do 50-minute hours of therapy and then put them in group therapy, and right? I just bombard them with therapy. But really, the exposure to these kind of activities was a very important component of the therapeutic intervention that allowed them to begin to make use of the social engagement systems, mm-hmm. right? So I think that's where these types of articles is helping us beginning thinking about programming, is how do we begin to not just increase people's social systems while being in a room with somebody or being in a group therapy session, whatever, but how do I help them engage in actions that help them feel safer in their bodies? And the signals from their bodies are sending signals that I could be open and flexible and responsive to my environment. And then I can engage in systems that actually activate kind of ways in which I can interact with my environment, mm-hmm. as opposed to defend myself against the environment.
And that's a significant change in state.
Exactly. Does that make some sense?
So in some ways, the yoga was the egg and the social engagement support was the chicken?
So you're trying to fit it into your metaphorical model. Right. However you do that, Matt,
I have a simple mind, Jerry. I have a simple mind.
However you do that is right. Right?
Just for maybe some other people, the therapy, because because again, we see a lot in the trauma research, and I think sometimes our discussions, we're sort of looking for the new information is I don't want people to take out, well, the social support, the relationship isn't important, because there's tons of, research that says, it's kind of, for some people, it might not, again, it may look different than just connecting with them in that way. And so maybe for therapy, for some folks, that actually helps, that social engagement helps their variable heart rate.
So I have another thought about this, kind of think about it, right? So there was a time in which say child welfare. Child welfare nationally really has three primary goals that they look at. They look at the issue of safety. They look at the issue of permanence, and they look at the issue of well-being, right? Oftentimes, we think picking a child up and moving them to a new home where there's nice people is adequate enough to address the issue, right? Then what we say is, oh, really what we have to do is find a forever place to do it, and that's what to do it. But really, the key really is that these issues work simultaneously together, is that if that child we're not working on their well-being, their bodies and what's going on with them, they can't feel safe in those environments. And if they can't feel safe, they're engaging in behaviors that are going to decrease the probability of it being permanent, right? So when you're kind of coming up with interventions, you have to address all of those issues, right? Is that if I have a child who doesn't have any place to belong or doesn't have any connectedness, and I'm working on their well-being, probably they're not going to make a lot of progress in life, right? To kind of look at that to be successful. If I just create a social environment for them without addressing some of these physiological, biological needs of it, they're not going to. So how do we take these components and add it into, if I just put you in a home and you're homeless, that's not adequate in order to make the changes we're looking at, right? Or if I just give you a meal, oftentimes you should be happy that I now put you in an apartment because now I've given you access to these resources, right? But really what this is telling us is sometimes these individuals can't effectively make use of and access these resources because we haven't changed something internally.
Great. Kurt, what are your thoughts? Especially, I think as someone who thinks about designing, I kind of thought about it like designing environments with the behavioral support things that you do. And I kind of wonder, I know social support a lot of times are part of those environments, obviously in big ways, but I just kind of, how's this kind of been informing you about those pieces as well?
Well, so let's kind of step into. I was thinking about schools actually while Jerry was talking, and one of the things that happens in schools, and I think it's mandated at this point for IEPs, is to do a functional behavior assessment. That you have to do that as you design a behavior intervention plan and you design a support system around an IEP. And this idea of changing states is so important to this functional behavior assessment, and it's just not included right now. I mean, I was trained as a behavior analyst to do functional behavior assessments, and we're just not trained in this, and I think it's really important that we are. So if we think about, I'm going to try and give an example that highlights how important this is. So let's take this issue of heart rate variability and safety, and the difference that the same environmental event or the same environmental cue can have entirely different meanings based on where we are in terms of our physiology. So as Jerry was alluding to, you can take a child who has been through incredibly traumatic and unpleasant experiences, who their physiology is now at a state of arousal where anything that is ambiguous to them, anything that they don't know exactly what it is interpreted as a threat. So you put them into a home with a lot of food and a lot of warmth and a lot of social engagement and a lot of people who want to touch them and a lot of people want to hold them and want to engage with them. Now all of those things don't feel safe, as opposed to if their physiology is different. Right? If they get into a state where they're now down the arousal continuum, where they're not in an alarm and a fear state, those same events have an incredibly different meaning, 180 degrees different meaning. And now they can engage in that. So as we think about what we're doing when we think about like a functional behavior assessment, right? In those two situations, based on that individual state, one behavior may be, the function of it may be attention. It may be actually accessing social support. On the other hand, the function of a behavior may be escape and avoidance. Based on their state, you would have a complete change, a 180-degree change in what the function of behavior is. And that's a really important thing to overlay on top of some of the interventions that we do. So you may have behavior that is regulatory in nature. That would be, in a functional behavior assessment, we'd call that automatic reinforcement. Right? So that may be the function. And in another situation, that may be, the function may be actually getting people to engage with you socially. So it's really important, I think, as a way of overlaying some thought and an additional lens on top of this idea of functional behavior assessment, and I'm not saying FBAs are bad, they're great. Actually, they're really helpful. Because they help us a lot with, one of the things we kind of do naturally as human beings is infer intent on the part of another person based on environmental cues and what their behavior is and on our own learning histories. And being systematic about that helps us be better about inferring intent. It gives us a better guess, essentially. And now we have even better information about how state impacts function. That's really important to overlay on top of that. So that's kind of one point. And the other one I want to make is about the idea, we were talking about this a little earlier, about positive repetitive experience and how those things help somebody to engage in a therapeutic intervention or make that therapeutic intervention more effective at a different point in time. And that's one of the things I think that's the most interesting about what I like to call the change moment, when we notice change happen, which usually is in retrospect. Like we're usually thinking about that later, right? Well, that child just decided to engage, or they developed a therapeutic alliance, and that became a magical kind of moment. And it's so fun that appears to be this magical kind of moment. But what it really is the cumulative effect of a whole bunch of experiences leading up to it that we probably did not notice. And when we look back on it, we're like, oh, that was the point at which that made the difference. And that was the important moment for me. And that happens to us. That's our experience of that moment. Like when we talk about that, we're not lying. We're not making it up. It's not we're not trying to be inaccurate with it. That's just the way that our brains and our bodies and our attention systems work. That's what we notice. So it seems magical. But all of those things Jerry was talking about putting in positive repetitive events as a part of our programming, they just keep increasing the probability of those magical change moments happening. And they do it in a very targeted way. So that's a great way to inform program design, is we know now what changes and what can have an impact in a positive direction on heart rate variability, which is, I like what you said, Matt, a lot about that it really can be a metric of the health of our social engagement system. And if we have a way of systematically creating programs that help us to improve that, but that's powerful. That's a huge thing to do. And it's informed a lot of, I think, what I've done and what people that I know, like who do it well. It really informs a lot of the decisions that they make on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis about their programs.
As you were talking, one of the thoughts that came to my mind is that we have these multiple systems, right? So we have defensive systems. We have social engagement systems. We have systems that are designed to regulate our physiological energy, like seeking food and seeking water, or right to kind of, and that in order to be successful in adapting to our environment, we have to both activate certain systems and we have to inhibit certain systems, right? To kind of manage that, so that in a way, in order to access the richness of our social environment, we have to downregulate our defensive systems and we have to upregulate our social engagement systems. That's a fairly complex process, right? It's not just, oh, okay, that's here and I go after it, but I've got to have some mechanism to down-regulate my ability. So if I, thinking about just sitting with a group, and I was thinking about just sitting in it with a group of individuals having a meal. I've got to be able to activate a system that allows me to eat and digest to get energy. That's a system in itself, right? And then I've got to have the ability to socially engage while I'm doing that. But then I've got to down-regulate my defensive system so that I don't attack somebody at the table or
when they reach towards your food.
That little task is a very complex biological process, right? And so if I don't have my body in a state or my expectations of what's going to happen to that experience is going to be, I have to be in a state of defensiveness, or it's going to be really difficult, even though I put the food on the table, right? That is one piece of it. But really getting people, and you think about matters, you'll think back to when we used to have these dining room with kids, where there was so many kids and so many variables going on, and then a kid would blow up and they'd get consequented to to be able to calm yourself in that environment and to be open to socially engaging while I'm eating. For a kid where food was unavailable, or it was like if I didn't get my food, somebody else was going to take it from me. I mean, that is a complex, really, that we don't really put a whole lot of thought into how to designing that.
Yep.
Well, and after I was at a high school last night when class went out before a presentation yesterday evening, and I just being in a high school hallway just regulated the heck out of me. And, I had a nice drive up, looked at some mountains all the way to Colorado Springs and Fountain. And it's, it's still, I think a lot of these, I've been thinking a lot about, transitions in education as well, and I think we all go through these when different environments, and you think about these young kids, there's such a different environment in art class than in PE, than in math. Sometimes I've been talking to my wife about this is sometimes there's rules for the classroom, but then you have indoor recess and those rules change dramatically as well. And so, again, kids that have some of those resources built up, come from healthy homes, have had that healthy attachment, can handle those fairly well. But again, a lot of the kids that we see really struggle with that into adulthood too. I mean, some of these conversations just kind of, one, it makes me really appreciate, especially my work in special education, when we had great occupational therapists we worked with, because that's, a bouncy chair or, just these sensory integration things. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's really in many ways what we're talking about is how can they help them, in some ways self-regulate and have these different tools that when they identify, which isn't an easy task in itself, that they're getting stressed out, that they can bring these to the front. But it almost seems like, boy, we throw kids into residential treatment, we throw people into prison systems, and we don't have any of this kind of, information about heart rate variability and all these things that seem to be should be driving treatment in a really major way. And, I kind of, my question is Jerry and both of you, I know all three of us have worked in residential with children, is how long, if we don't have those kind of assessments up front in some ways, how long does it take and how many failures do we sometimes put the kids through before we know, hey, this kid just needs to be by themselves maybe for, every hour they're in the cafeteria, they need at least 15 minutes by themselves to down-regulate. Sometimes it feels like the cafeteria example, we're setting kids up in environments that their biology is nowhere close to ready to.
I think about those three categories of social support I think we can all resonate with the experience of having moments when what we need in terms of social support is not necessarily somebody to engage in a real deep discussion, but just when somebody's around and not even talk, right? I mean, think about significant others, right? How important that is, that they're just there. You're not even talking. There's just another person around. And I think that's one of the things that I pull out of those three areas of social support as you think about your physiology. One of the things that could be predictive of when that's the type of social support that you need may be heart rate variability. And it may be that when your heart rate variability is in a state where it's low and you're activated, I don't need to talk, I just need you to be around. And when I get regulated, then I probably want to talk a little bit. But right now, that's not what I need. So those things, I think, the interaction between how we think about what our internal state is and what we need in terms of our social environments, I think is a really powerful thing to pull out of an article like this. And, think about the point, point well made about putting a whole bunch of kids with low heart rate variability, essentially like elevated stress responses, into a packed social environment that's a challenge. And as Jerry, pointed out really well, like we don't think about that stuff, probably as much as we could. And in some ways, there are times when even if we think about it, there's not much we can do about that. Like that may be just the structure that we have to do, but we can also be mindful of it as caregivers when we are in those situations when we're like, okay, I really need to support you right now. Like I'm here, I'm around, and I may not even be talking to you. And that may be what you need right now. And that doesn't mean that we're not providing social support. That may be the type of social support that is needed in those moments. And I love the ability to have a physiological marker that can help us be predictive of that and informed about that. So I love those kind of points out of an article like this.
And is there any because I'm sure some of our audience is feeling like I'm feeling. It's like, well, what the hell do we do? Because even I think with the Welltory app, it's nice. I wouldn't suggest anybody use that as a clinical tool. I think it's a nice thing right now, maybe for self-insight. I think if you put one of the running heart rate monitors, you might get more information, but you're not necessarily getting real time, the technology, unless you've got a major grant with like National Institutes of Health or something, you're not going to know the heart rate variability for at least an individual. I think most of our folks will not have any clue about heart rate variability within the folks they're working with. And at the same time, if the cafeteria triggers your heart rate variability, even if you have you'd have to take a real time reading to get to know the kids in there. So it's like, what is, around program design, where we're still are we still just kind of left as we got to trial and error this out at this point? Is there any like concrete things? Okay, this is how we can think about this today. Like this is, we don't have the technology yet. We're not going to know heart rate variability. Again, we got some apps, but they're apps.
So Matt, you're raising a really important challenge, right? I think what you're raising is we're all looking for how do we translate what we're learning in research to clinical application, right? And that's the challenge we have. So we're learning that certain experiences alter your genetic makeup that is going to, in some ways, not only impact you, but impact the next generation, right? Epigenetics that we talked about on one of our episodes. Really great. That's a really insightful, great information. What's the clinical application of that, right? And I think that as we have these discussions and bring these topics up, really, for me, what I end up thinking about is when I'm working with either a child in a treatment center or I'm working with staff, and they're reacting to these behaviors and their responses, if I just consequence this child it's going to change, right? That's been our traditional. If you get misbehave and you blow up in the dining room, my response is you are out of the dining room for 3 days and now you can go back into it, right? Or you lose recess for a certain amount of time. What it helps is having a more, one is deeper understanding. Two is having a compassionate understanding of what that experience might be for that individual in that dining room. And three is developing strategies that increase the likelihood of that child or that adult or that couple successfully engaging in behaviors that are going to be rewarding and adaptive for them. So we have to take this information and not just say, oh, okay, and now I go and do heart rate variability. Is really how do I adapt it to what I'm doing to give me more insight to be a better clinician or better case manager or better teacher, to really begin to understand that. And I think that's the translatability of research into practice. And that's always the challenge, right? That's always the challenge. And hopefully that's what maybe we can provide, because having a deeper understanding of this research allows us to help you translate it into something you could do. But really just getting a monitor and kind of taking your heart rate variability, that in itself is not going to be ineffective unless you say I begin to find some patterns in my own life that when I do these types of things, it changes my heart rate variability. That makes it easier for me to socially engage. It makes it easier for me to downregulate my defensive systems. Then you could begin to use that data for your individual. You are a one-person research project, right? That's where it might be helpful to you. So again, if I have a client, maybe I give them that information and we begin to help them look at, so tell me about when you were really upset yesterday and you took that measure. What did you learn about yourself? And how do we begin to build in some strategies, how to look at that? But that's how I think we have to use research to inform us in certain things about how we might better design programs to get better results. But some research is hard to translate.
And I think this is difficult to translate.
Right.
It's complicated. Like, these are complex systems and these are kind of complex concepts to think about. But one of the fun things I think about having something that is this complicated, you use it as an intervention, is that in the process of leading people, both clients and providers, along the pathway of understanding this kind of complexity, what I get most jazzed by, and I think is some of the most enjoyable interactions, are when, as we go through people integrating these ideas into their existing mental models and the way that they think about it, more creativity comes out of that. I think I've learned more by sitting down with a young clinician, or sitting down with a foster parent, or a staff on a unit, or with a client, and we start talking about how their physiology impacts their behavior and how the functions of behavior change, like some of these concepts. And as we talk about them and get into them and tie them back to their everyday experiences, they come up with ways to apply it that I never would have thought of. And that emerges from, and that's part of the application of this clinically, is talking about it and teaching about it and having discussions about it that tie it back to people's everyday experience. And boy, like I've seen foster parents come up with ideas about, oh, well, if that happens, then we can do this and that will impact their heart rate variability. And then like, yeah, great, I never would have thought of that, let's do it. And they think about it differently, right? They're in those social environments every single day and are an integral part of those social environments. They often have better ideas than I do about how to alter them or how to change them in subtle ways. That is really fun to come out of. And then I get to tell stories about it to other people. It's really an enjoyable intervention to do. Classrooms do the same thing. People come up with really creative ways of applying some of this stuff.
Kurt, from your background, it would seem to me that really these defensive systems, these social engagement systems, these biological systems, their context, that an individual has to evaluate the context and activate certain systems and downregulate other systems. And that trauma interferes with the contextualization, the people's ability to adapt to the context that they're in.
Yes.
Right? It's
Right.
not the problem of their defensive system. We all have the defensive system, but we shut it off in order to activate a different system. But it's the match between not being able to accurately assess the current context and then somehow use that information to activate systems. So a trauma individual sees threat even when there's safety there, right?
Right.
So the issue really is, from your perspective, how to help these individuals more accurately assess the situation based on, as opposed to using past history to anticipate what's there or misperceiving, so that they can activate the correct system to access really what it is that they really want in life, right?
Yeah, that goes back to the last article we talked about that heart rate variability predicted the extinction of conditioned fear and the learning of new safety cues.
Right.
It interferes with that process, which is fundamental to, that's indicative of the shutting down and the activating of systems. That's what is the mechanism that underlies those learning processes. And all of this,
Right.
our physiology.
So if we're thinking about sequencing treatment, right, is how do we create stability in the individual, right? How do you get them feeling safe enough and regulated enough, which is the first phase of most trauma treatment, is about stabilization before you start engaging in trauma processing, the kind of looking at that piece. And then really looking at future goals. And so there's a sequence to what we're learning across many. It's not whether you pick this, but that's a kind of a principle that goes across many treatments that you can't get engaged in this, is how do you think that fits in, kind of validates that process that we're learning, that you can't do future-orientated goal setting before you make somebody feel safe. You can't reason before you regulate.
Right.
All this stuff is really supporting those concepts.
Yeah, there's just a ton of convergent validity on a lot of these approaches that, I think that's indicative of being on the right track for understanding the mechanisms as things converge on the same points. It gives you a lot of validity to a lot of the models that we put together.
Right. So as our listeners take this away, sometimes rather than when we talk about these complex topics, it makes people feel like, well, now what do I need to do? And in a way, I think is to go back to what you're already doing and ask yourself what I'm doing, is it in some ways the reason I'm getting good results is I'm already doing some of these things. I'm already paying attention to helping my clients find some stability and safety in their lives and structure and consistency. And then we're working on building some skills and other kinds of things. And then that is going to validate some of the things you're already doing. This research, as opposed to throwing everything out and starting over because I now have a new concept.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to wrap up today. So great discussion. I think this is another piece of this is getting us to look deeper. So Kurt, Jerry, thanks very much. I learned a lot today, so hopefully our listeners did as well. So again, we'll put this article up, traumainformedlens.org, along with show notes, some discussion questions. Thanks for listening. We'll continue our series on heart rate variability next week. So we will see you then. Until then, have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you.